Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I've been attending the Indian Ocean Defence and Security Conference in Perth, IODS, and as usual, most of the useful parts of it were in the separate discussions and meetings rather than the formal presentations, though some of those were okay. And I'll mention one in particular, a 10-minute speech by the head of the Australian Submarine Agency, Vice Admiral Jonathon Mead. Now, after some of the usual pro-AUKUS blather, he actually said that there were going to be a whole lot of difficulties and roadblocks ahead. And I thought, hallelujah. As regular listeners know, one of the things that I have found most frustrating about AUKUS discussions, particularly AUKUS Pillar 1, is just the ridiculous amount of unqualified optimism that has been coming from Australian politicians and Australian defence figures. So at the very least, we now have a welcome dose of realism after 2 years of nonsense about how everything is going wonderfully well and according to plan, and there are no problems whatsoever. So there's nothing like a bit more truth for the Australian public, and it could be that Admiral Mead has had a dose of reality after having been absolutely, totally filleted in Senate estimates by Green Senator David Shoebridge, something I've dealt with in previous podcasts, and for more detail you can go to the current edition of the magazine. As I've previously speculated, and I'm not a psychologist, but until his complete destruction at the hands of Senator Shoebridge, he had probably never encountered a word of dissent or scepticism about any of these grand plans, and yet he was suddenly, in the public gaze, forced to confront the reality that we don't know how the sale of second-hand Virginia-class submarines will play out, because there are numerous factors involved that simply are beyond Australia's control. Now, that note of caution from Vice Admiral Mead actually dovetailed several other discussions that I had, and these included chats with mainly industry people, both from the UK and the US. Now, an important first step in the whole AUKUS process is the permanent basing of 4 or 5 Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines in Australia, and possibly a UK astute as well from 2027. That's well known. Forget this nonsense, by the way, about a rotational deployment. That's just a form of weasel words to sort of cover up for the fact that the submarines are going to be based here permanently. It's just that they won't be here for the next 20 years of their service lives. A new one or replacement one will arrive every few months. So it's not a rotational deployment, it's permanent deployment. And there were a few jokes about things like the accommodation that needs to be built of being far higher quality than the RAN itself receives. I think that actually came from Chief of Navy Vice Admiral Hammond. I know he's joking, but I didn't find that particularly funny. People who have previously been involved in nuclear submarine programs in the UK and the US say that, in their opinion, and this is a collective view, not just one person, a collective view, that Australia is already 10 years behind where we need to be. And one very simple metric is that with submarine crews, you always have a mixture of experienced personnel and newer recruits and some trainees. The experts tell me that what a submarine needs to be able to be operated safely and effectively are a corps of sailors and officers who have around 20 years of experience, because after that period of time, they've basically seen it all and they're in a position to deal with any realistic contingency. Now, the problem with that is obviously simple, basic maths. Australia will supposedly take delivery of a second-hand Virginia-class in 2032, meaning ideally training should have started in 2012 and not 2023. Also, there was some talk at the conference of the Australian submarines are going to need mixed crews because of this experience deficit issue. So, they might have the red kangaroo painted on the side of the submarine sail, but the crews, by the look of it, are going to be some Australians, some US personnel, and some UK personnel. Another point of contention, particularly here in Western Australia, is the non-existence of a dry dock in the Henderson HMAS Stirling complex area that is absolutely essential for longer-term submarine support. Despite several years of talk, there has been little to no progress in actually building this facility, and even its location has not yet been finalised because there seems to be some sort of weird, total disconnect between the ALP federal government and the ALP state government. Well, actually, the real disconnect is probably at the bureaucratic level, but the fact that it's occurring at a political level is not helping. Now, Defence Minister Richard Marles gave a strange answer to a question about it, saying, yes, it was urgent that a dry dock be built, but that the government still had some time, which sounds rather contradictory to me. Oh, and by the way, on the human factors level, his staff or Defence Department staff went out of their way to make it known that rather than being referred to as Deputy Prime Minister, he needed to be called the Acting Prime Minister, because Prime Minister Albanese is on holidays at the moment. Now, as I've said before, this is just a personal quirk, I've found this conceit to be more than a bit annoying and seems to be the byproduct of what I can only assume is some kind of very deep insecurity. Anyway, I imagine there's been some form of diplomatic protest because the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Ben Key, had obviously not received that memo and on several occasions referred incorrectly to the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, that's a bit of a faux pas. Now, also the First Sea Lord distinguished himself by saying, again in answer to a journalist's question during a panel session, yeah, if you want us to build submarines for you, then we deserve the $5 billion you colonials are set to give us, so just hand it over. Okay, I'm paraphrasing that only slightly, but there's more that I can say about these enormous cash transfers to the US and the UK. And let me try and do it as simply as possible. If you're going to go to the supermarket to do your weekly shop, the day before, do you transfer a certain amount of money so that the supermarket can hire an extra person to be able to handle your presence? If you're going to buy a car the year before, do you transfer some money to Mitsubishi or Hyundai or whoever so that they can hire an extra couple of workers to build your car for you? No, of course it doesn't work like that. You build that into the price of the thing that you're purchasing. Australia has either volunteered it or we've been conned into it, and it's even worse because the money that we are giving to the US in particular, that will be used to build new Virginia-class submarines for them, but they sell to us, second-hand Virginia-class submarines. I mean, for me, even at the most simple level, the deal just looks completely wrong. Anyway, now, and to lighten the mood a bit, as an aside, I've known a couple of Deputy Prime Ministers reasonably well. They both happen to be from the Labor side, Julia Gillard, and much earlier back in Hawke Keating days, Lionel Bowen. Everyone knows of Julia Gillard, of course, but Lionel Bowen was Attorney General and Deputy Prime Minister for 7 years between 1983 and 1990. What I can say about both him and Julia Gillard is that at a personal level, they are both, or were both since Lionel passed away in 2012, kind, decent, low-profile people. I cannot imagine either of them insisting on a particular title. You called someone by their ministerial rank or their first name. None of this affected, egomaniacal nonsense of trying to make yourself look more important and powerful than you actually are. Anyway, coincidentally or not, Defence Minister Richard Marles has actually received something of a downgrade in Sunday's ministerial reshuffle. I don't know if anyone has commented upon it. Most of the focus has been on Claire O'Neill, but the Defence Industry Minister, Pat Conroy, has been moved to Cabinet with a greatly strengthened series of responsibilities primarily for the newly identified area of capability delivery. And this means that he will be controlling most of the defence budget. And wow, does he have a huge job in front of him. This means that Miles will be left with the largely ceremonial stuff, since there are also other ministers focused on things like veterans affairs and personnel issues. Now, that might suit him well, with even more time available for critical missions for the future of Australia, such as spending more time on the golf course. Now, back to the serious stuff. There was another very important event at the conference, which is written up on the APDR website, the news that the South Korean government has guaranteed that it can deliver the first Australian General Purpose Frigate under C-3000 by 2029 and the next two in 2030. Or, if the Australians want it even faster, all three could be delivered in 2029. Now, this is only possible because the Korean designs being offered by Hyundai Heavy Industries and Hanwha Ocean, respectively, are owned by the Defence Acquisition Program Agency, the agency that contracts the designs out to maintain competitive pressure amongst the shipbuilders and to allow new players to come into the market if that makes sense. I hope that Defence and the Australian government are smart enough to understand just how powerful this offer is, basically de-risking the entire program and throwing the full weight of Korea behind it. The offer has been conveyed by ROKN Rear Admiral Shin, Director General, Naval Ship Program Department. So it's official. Having said that, I assume that there must be some boundaries to that offer. I'm guessing most importantly that the Australians do not constantly fiddle with the design, something that has cursed numerous previous shipbuilding contracts. And my guess is the offer must be along the lines of guaranteed delivery based on Australians signing off on the critical design review of the ships. And I also hope that Korea has not only made that offer in writing, but that Hyundai and Hanwha Ocean will also include it as part of their formal response to defence. And that is because we all want to avoid the total fiasco around the failure of Army and this government to deliver Taipan helicopters to Ukraine. Who remembers that one? Well, I certainly do. The excuse, it barely deserves the name, was that the Ukrainians only made the formal request for the helicopters on December the 15th last year after the wrecking process had commenced. All along the way, everyone should have been aware of Ukraine's interest, and they were notified by Opposition Senator David Fawcett in early October, but we are expected to believe that none of that counted, and during a critical few weeks we were all lied to and told that all of the helicopters had been irreparably damaged by the time the formal request was received. And I would hope that no one in this country wants to see a repeat of that, do they? We would not want to be in a position where another bidder was selected for the General Purpose Frigate, and the Koreans were told that no one was aware of their offer, or that it was not a part of their response and therefore could not be considered as part of the formal evaluation. And that's a comment on how low things have sunk in this country. Oh, and by the way, so that I hope I'm not sounding like too partisan or prejudging the outcome of the General Purpose Frigate competition, this doesn't preclude the selection of the Japanese, German or Spanish designs, but in my life, I've never before seen another government make this sort of direct, blunt commitment. And by the way, it goes well beyond what the US has done for nuclear-powered submarines, where they've put in place a number of steps that have to go through. I've detailed those in previous episodes. So there's a high level, I believe, a high level of uncertainty about that, despite all of the US goodwill. Whereas the offer from Korea seems rather blunter, far less ambiguous, and I don't see that the Koreans have allowed themselves any escape clauses or wriggle room, other than, as I say, my assumption that at some point the design will have to be finalized. You can't just have an open-ended process. I do sound at times like an advertisement for Korea, and in fact I am. I keep an eye on what's happening in that part of the world very closely, and there is a new security dynamic in North Asia which is shifting to closer and closer links and coordination between South Korea, Japan, and the US. And in my view, unless Australia is careful, we will miss out and will ultimately become largely irrelevant to what is going on. When we look at the capabilities of the South Korean and Japanese militaries, they have huge punch, huge capability. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at their air forces, their navies, or their armies, but they are orders of magnitude larger than what Australia is able to field. Just look at diesel-electric submarines. Between them, they have more than 40, which they're continually replacing with updated versions. And they have more on the way. They have gigantic surface fleets, huge air forces, and big armies many times the size of Australia. We have geography going for us, but in terms of providing actual military support for the United States, then Japan and South Korea are so far ahead that we, Australia, have become a distant speck in the rear vision mirror. And for people who measure things purely in terms of hard power, I don't, though it is very important, Australia is already largely irrelevant to US warfighting calculations, whereas Japan and South Korea definitely are not. Now, if delivered, nuclear-powered submarines will have an impact on that, but obviously only once they arrive, and that's not in the next 10 years. As a quick digression, if Minister Conroy, with his new responsibilities, really wants to be effective in delivering capability, he should visit South Korea as soon as possible and spend a couple of days with DARPA figuring out how they do things. And if the minister is too busy to do it, he should instruct some brighter people in CASG and capability development to visit and write a paper within a month about how Australia could learn from Korea. Now, on the rapid delivery of capability, I have to circle back again to why the offer of corvettes from Luerssen using the existing WA supply chain has been ignored. I asked Richard Miles, he dodged the question. I was able to finally pin down someone else with detailed knowledge, and the answer that I got was, it doesn't meet the requirement. To which I asked, what effing requirement? And the answer was to the General Purpose Frigate requirement. I mean, are people really that stupid? The corvette idea was never about replacing the General Purpose Frigates. If it had been, Luerssen would have offered a 3,500-ton design rather than a 2,200 one. The idea behind the corvette is to give the RAN and Australia as much early capability as possible while keeping the workforce and supply chain in place. To try and take this back to its simplest level so that hopefully everyone can understand it, originally we were going to receive 12 OPVs. That has been reduced to 6. So now we go back to the original 12 with the final 6 in the advanced Block 2 capability, a super Arafura, if you will, being slightly larger and armed with 16 VS cells apiece. Is it really that difficult to understand? Anyway, I've run out of time again. There's a lot more to come out of IODS. I've got a bit more to say as well by way of anecdote in terms of politicians who thankfully don't have large egos, but that's for another day. As always, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.